The scent of my grandmother's roses was the smell of coming home. It was a fragrance woven into the fabric of my earliest memories, a sweet, delicate perfume that promised safety and peace. I had returned to this scent, to this house, seeking both. My name is Anna, and for a decade, I had been an ER nurse in a major city, a life lived at a full sprint under the relentless glare of fluorescent lights. I had seen too much, absorbed too much of the world's pain, and the frantic, chaotic rhythm of the city had finally worn me down to a raw nerve. I had come back to the quiet, tree-lined street of my childhood to care for my grandfather, Arthur, and, in doing so, to try and piece my own weary soul back together. Our home was an island of history in the manicured sea of Aspen Ridge. It was a sturdy, 1950s brick house on a generous half-acre lot, the one my grandfather had built with his own two hands after returning from the Korean War. When he built it, the area was mostly farmland. Over the decades, the farms had been sold off, and the upscale development of Aspen Ridge had bloomed around us, a collection of sprawling, modern homes with three-car garages and perfectly uniform landscaping. Our house, with its mature garden, its slightly faded original window trim, and the historic hand-built workshop in the back, was a gentle, stubborn anomaly. Arthur, even at 85, was as solid and unyielding as the house he'd built. He was a quiet man, a former military police officer who carried himself with a ramrod-straight posture that had survived the passage of years. He was a man of routines and deep, unshakable principles. His life was his garden, his workshop, and the quiet dignity of his home. My purpose here was simple: to help him with the heavy lifting, to keep him company, and to bask in the tranquil order of his world. The agent of chaos arrived on the third day of my return. She didn't knock. She appeared at the edge of the lawn while Arthur and I were weeding the rose bushes, a task he still insisted on doing himself, though his back protested. The woman was in her late 50s, clad in expensive athleisure wear, her face a taut mask of aggressive wellness. She carried a tablet like a weapon. "Good morning, Arthur," she said, her voice bright but brittle. Her gaze swept over our property with a clear, critical eye, lingering on the old workshop. "Diane," my grandfather replied, his tone polite but cool. He did not stop his work. "I see your granddaughter is here," she continued, her eyes flicking to me for a fraction of a second before dismissing me. "I trust she has been brought up to speed on the Aspen Ridge covenants." "This is Anna," Arthur said simply. "She knows how to be a good neighbor." Diane's smile was thin and sharp. "I'm sure she does. Which is why I'm here." The board had another discussion about the outbuilding. She gestured toward the workshop. "It's simply not in compliance. The siding is a non-approved material, and it's a full 50 square feet larger than the bylaws permit for an accessory structure. It's an eyesore, and it's dragging down the aesthetic of the entire cul-de-sac." "That shed has been standing there for 70 years. Diane," Arthur said, his voice dropping into a low, patient rumble. "It was here long before your bylaws were a gleam in a developer's eye." "That may be," she snapped, her brittle cheerfulness evaporating. "But the rules are the rules. We've been very patient. It needs to come down." Then she added the line that revealed her true motive, the poison dart hidden in the flower of her argument. "Frankly, Arthur, a lot this large is wasted with such an old house on it. A developer friend of mine was just saying he would pay a significant premium for this parcel. Tearing down that old shed would be the first step in preparing the property for a much more profitable use." There it was. This wasn't about a shed. This was a shakedown. She wanted our land. She was the tip of the spear for a developer who saw our home not as a place of memory and history, but as an undervalued asset to be flipped. "This house is not for sale," I said, my voice quiet but firm. It was the first time I had spoken directly to her. "And the workshop is staying." Diane turned her full attention to me, and it was like being caught in the glare of a searchlight. Her eyes were cold, calculating, and filled with a profound, dismissive arrogance. "You'll find, dear," she said, her voice dripping with condescension, "that in Aspen Ridge, we have ways of ensuring compliance. This isn't the city. There is an order to things here." She turned and marched away, leaving the scent of her expensive perfume hanging in the air like a threat. I looked at my grandfather. He had returned to his roses, his hands moving with slow, deliberate care. "Grandpa." "She's a predator. Annie," he said, not looking up. "She smells what she thinks is weakness. An old man and his granddaughter. She thinks she can push us out." He finally paused and met my gaze, his eyes as clear and steady as they had been 60 years ago. "She's about to learn that this old man's roots run deep." The first phase of Diane's campaign to oust us was death by 1,000 paper cuts. The official notices of violation from the Aspen Ridge HOA began arriving with a frequency that bordered on harassment. Each was a meticulously documented, utterly ridiculous assault on the history and character of our home, a clear attempt to bury us in fines and force us into submission. The first letter, which arrived a few days after our initial confrontation, was, as threatened, about the workshop. It was a formal citation, declaring the 70-year-old structure to be in violation of a bylaw written a mere decade ago. The letter demanded we demolish the building within 90 days, or face a monthly fine of $500. It was an absurd, legally unenforceable demand, given the shed's pre-existing, grandfathered status. But it was a clear declaration of her intent. The next notice, a week later, cited the color of our window trim. It was a soft, historic sage green, the same color my grandmother had chosen in 1955. According to Diane's letter, it was not on the approved palette of beige, taupe, and greige. The fine was $100 per window. We had 14 windows. "She wants us to spend a fortune to paint our house a color that looks like mud," Arthur grumbled, holding the letter as if it were a piece of contaminated waste. "It's not about the paint, Grandpa," I said, my old triage instincts kicking in. In a crisis, the first step is always to assess the situation calmly and document everything. I was already creating a new file on my laptop, a digital log of every interaction, every letter, every threat. This is about establishing a pattern. She's building a case that we're negligent homeowners, trying to create a pretext for some kind of bigger action. We tried, at first, to be reasonable. We couldn't tear down the workshop, but perhaps we could appease her on the smaller things. We received a fine for the height of my grandfather's flagpole, a flagpole from which he had flown the American flag every day for 60 years. The bylaws, she claimed, stipulated a maximum height of 20 feet. His was 25. The fine was $200. Rather than fight, Arthur, with a heavy heart, spent a weekend with a hacksaw, shortening the pole by 5 feet. It looked stunted, ridiculous, a symbol of our forced compliance. We paid the fine. We hoped it would be seen as a gesture of peace. It was not. The following week, we were fined because a small patch of moss was growing on a flagstone in our shaded side yard. It was a landscaping violation. We were fined because the classic period-appropriate lantern on our porch was not the approved bronze finish fixture. We were fined because the morning newspaper, delivered at 5 a.m., was still in our driveway at 7:30 a.m., constituting a litter violation. With each new, ludicrous charge, I responded with a polite, formal letter. I did not argue or get emotional. I simply stated the facts. For the fines related to the historic elements of our home, I reiterated the property's pre-existing status and formally rejected the fine. For the smaller, more absurd fines like the newspaper, we paid them, but I documented each payment as being made under protest. My letters to the board were meticulously crafted. They were not the letters of an angry homeowner. They were the carefully worded documents of someone building a legal case. I referenced specific state laws regarding HOA overreach. I cited the legal principle of prior non-conforming use. I formally requested, in writing, a copy of the minutes from the board meetings where these violations were supposedly discussed. My internal monologue during those weeks was a constant stream of assessment and strategy. Document the pattern. Establish a clear timeline of harassment. Show a clear link between our refusal to sell and the sudden, intense scrutiny. Create an unimpeachable record of our own reasonableness and her escalating aggression. It was the same methodical, evidence-based approach I had used in the ER to document a patient's deteriorating condition. In this case, the patient was our peaceful life, and the disease was Diane. After a month of this bureaucratic siege, I sent a final, summary letter to the entire HOA board via certified mail. It detailed the 16 separate violation notices we had received, the thousands of dollars in illegitimate fines she had attempted to levy, and the specific ways in which her actions constituted a targeted harassment campaign in violation of state law. The letter concluded, "We have complied with every reasonable request, despite the dubious nature of the violations. However, the campaign of harassment continues unabated. This letter serves as our final attempt to resolve this matter amicably. Any further attempts to fine, harass, or otherwise interfere with the quiet enjoyment of our property will be met with a significant civil lawsuit seeking damages against the HOA as an entity and against its board members in their personal capacity for breach of fiduciary duty." It was a direct, legally sound threat. I was no longer just documenting. I was drawing a line in the sand. I was warning her that if she crossed it, there would be severe consequences. I knew a woman like Diane, so blinded by greed and arrogance, would not be able to resist the challenge. She would be forced to escalate, and I would be ready. The destruction of my grandmother's rose bushes was the moment the conflict turned from a legal battle into a personal war. These were not just flowers. They were a living legacy, a breathtakingly beautiful collection of heirloom roses that my grandmother had cultivated for over 40 years. After she passed, Arthur had tended to them with a devotion that was both heartbreaking and beautiful. They were his most tangible connection to the love of his life. The bushes lined the walkway to our front door, and in the summer, they exploded into a riot of color and perfume, a testament to decades of loving care. I found the damage on a Monday morning, a harsh chemical smell, like bleach and something else. Something oily, hung in the air. The leaves on every single one of the 24 bushes were wilted and curled, with ugly, black-edged splotches spreading across them. The magnificent, multi-hued blooms, pinks, reds, and creamy whites were drooping, their petals already turning a sickly, translucent brown. They had been deliberately poisoned, a chemical assault in the dead of night. Arthur stood beside me, his face a mask of stony, silent grief. He reached out a trembling hand and touched a wilted, blackened rose. His expression, one of utter devastation. For the first time since I had returned home, my grandfather looked truly old. He looked defeated. A rage, cold and pure and utterly focused, settled deep within me. This was not a fine. This was not a nasty letter. This was a desecration, a vile act of cruelty designed to wound my grandfather in the deepest possible way. It was a message from Diane, delivered in the language of poison and death. I can touch you. I can take away what you love most. That day, the empathetic, patient nurse in me was put on a shelf. The methodical, analytical part of my training took over. There was a wound, and it needed to be treated. The disease, Diane, needed to be excised. My first move was to secure the perimeter. I spent the afternoon researching and purchasing a top-of-the-line security system. I chose a system with multiple high-resolution, full-color night vision cameras, motion sensors, and a powerful digital video recorder with a secure, off-site cloud backup. I was not just looking for a deterrent. I was looking for evidence. For what a detective friend once called evidentiary quality footage. For the next 2 days, Arthur and I worked in a state of grim, silent purpose. We mounted the cameras, running the cables through the attic and concealing them under the eaves. We created overlapping fields of view that covered every inch of our property, from the street to the back fence. The system was subtle, almost invisible to the casual observer, but its coverage was total. While we worked, Arthur began a project of his own. He retreated to his workshop, the historic outbuilding that Diane so despised. I heard the sounds of him moving heavy objects. When I went to check on him, I saw that he had dragged a heavy, olive-drab military footlocker from a dusty corner. It was stenciled with his old unit number from his time as an MP in Korea. He opened it, and the scent of old canvas, leather, and gun oil filled the air. Inside, nestled in carefully cut felt, lay his past. There was his old dress uniform, neatly folded. There were his medals, tarnished with age. And there, in a custom leather holster, was his service pistol, a 1948 Colt government model .45. It was a beautiful, formidable-looking weapon, its blued steel finish worn smooth in places from years of handling. He took the pistol out with a familiar reverence. He sat at his workbench and, with the calm, practiced movements of a man who had done this 1,000 times, he began to meticulously disassemble, clean, and oil it. He didn't say a word. He didn't have to. The quiet, deliberate ritual was a message in itself. It was an act of a man reclaiming his strength, of a peacekeeper preparing for the possibility of war. He was reminding himself, and me, that there were lines that, once crossed, demanded a response. He finished cleaning the Colt, reassembled it with a series of satisfyingly solid clicks, and placed it back in its holster. He did not, I noted, put it back in the footlocker. He placed it in the drawer of the small table in the front entryway of our house, the drawer where he kept the mail. A few nights after the cameras were installed, a new, minor act of vandalism occurred. We found one of the heavy ceramic pots on our porch toppled over. The dirt spilled out, the flowers inside crushed. It was a small thing, but it was enough. I pulled up the footage from the camera that covered the porch. At 3:12, a figure dressed in dark clothing, a hoodie pulled low, had crept onto our lawn, run up to the porch, and kicked the pot over before scurrying away. The figure was unidentifiable, but just before they ran off, they glanced back toward the street. And in that one moment, they passed under the glow of a streetlight. For a fraction of a second, the camera captured a clear shot of the side of their vehicle. Parked down the street, a late model, white Lexus SUV, Diane's car. It wasn't enough to prove in a court of law that she was the one in the hoodie, but it was enough for me. It was a clear, documented link between her and the ongoing acts of harassment. I saved the video clip, labeling it with the date and time, and added it to my growing file. I was no longer just a nurse caring for her grandfather. I was an intelligence officer gathering evidence on a hostile target. And the target was getting bolder, sloppier. And that meant she was getting closer to making a fatal mistake. With our property now under a blanket of digital surveillance, direct acts of vandalism became too risky for Diane. So, like a guerrilla fighter changing tactics, she moved the battle to the realm of psychological warfare. She launched a coordinated campaign of slander and social isolation, using the Aspen Ridge online forum and community gossip as her primary weapons. The forum was a private, members-only website, a digital reflection of Diane's rigidly controlled world. It was a place for announcements about yoga classes and complaints about garbage can placement. It was also her personal propaganda outlet. I gained access using the login of a sympathetic older neighbor who was also a friend of my grandfather's and was disgusted by Diane's behavior. Her first post was a masterclass in passive aggression. It was a long, flowery message about preserving the unique character and property values of Aspen Ridge. She wrote about the importance of community cohesion and the dangers of letting things slide. Then came the poisoned dart, aimed directly at us. "It is incumbent upon all of us," she wrote, "to maintain our properties to the highest standard. Unfortunately, some long-standing properties have begun to show their age. We must be vigilant against the slow creep of disrepair, as it affects all of us. A single, poorly maintained property can have a devastating impact on the value of an entire street." She didn't use our names, but everyone knew who she was talking about. We were the oldest house on the street. The comments section filled with supportive messages from her allies. So true. "Diane, we have to protect our investment. I've noticed that old shed. It really is an eyesore. Maybe some people just aren't a good fit for this community anymore." The next phase of her attack was more direct. She began to target my grandfather personally. A new post appeared, this one expressing concern for Arthur. "It is with a heavy heart that I bring this up," she began, her tone oozing with false sympathy. "But many of us have noticed a decline in the upkeep of the old Miller property since Arthur's granddaughter moved in. While it is admirable that she is here to care for him, we must ensure that our elderly residents are not being taken advantage of or manipulated. Sometimes, new arrivals with power of attorney do not have the community's or their elderly relatives' best interests at heart." It was a vile, despicable insinuation. She was painting me as a manipulative gold digger, and my grandfather as a senile, incompetent victim. She was twisting my act of love and care into something sinister. The online slander quickly translated into real-world isolation. The few polite waves we received from neighbors ceased entirely. When Arthur and I went for our evening walks, we were met with cold stares or averted gazes. People would cross the street to avoid us. We were being treated like a contagion. The most painful cut came when my grandfather's oldest friend in the neighborhood, a man he had played cards with every Thursday for 30 years, called to cancel their game, stammering a flimsy excuse. Arthur didn't say anything after the call, but I saw the deep, wounded look in his eyes. This was the true cost of Diane's war. It wasn't about money or property. It was about dignity, about friendship, about a lifetime of good standing in the community he loved. That night, my anger, which had been a cold, controlled flame, became a white-hot furnace. This was no longer just about defending our home. It was about defending my grandfather's honor. I retreated to my office, the digital command center of our quiet home. The time for passive evidence gathering was over. It was time to go on the offensive. I started a new, encrypted file on my laptop, titling it Investigation_Vance_D. I began to use the skills I had, not as a nurse, but as a citizen of the digital age. I started with public record searches, property tax databases, and county clerk websites. I spent hours cross-referencing names, addresses, and corporate filings. A picture began to emerge. I found the developer who Diane had mentioned, the one who was interested in our property. His company, Northgate Developers, had a history of aggressive acquisition tactics and a string of lawsuits from other communities. I found the incorporation documents for the Aspen Ridge HOA, and I found Diane's name, not just as president, but as the original registered agent, a detail that suggested a deeper, more foundational involvement than most residents knew. Then, I found the smoking gun. In the county's digital records of property transfers, I found a series of quitclaim deeds. Several years ago, Northgate Developers had sold a small, seemingly worthless strip of common area land to a private LLC. I traced the LLC, and after peeling back 2 layers of corporate anonymity, I found the name of the sole registered member, Diane Vance. The developer had given her a piece of the community, a small kingdom of her own, likely in exchange for her loyalty and her influence on the board. Her corruption wasn't just a suspicion, it was a matter of public record, hidden in plain sight. I saved every document, every screenshot. The file grew, becoming a dense, irrefutable dossier of her entire corrupt enterprise. She had tried to isolate us, to define us with her lies, but in the quiet solitude she had forced upon us, I had found her truth, and her truth would be her undoing. Having failed to break us with social pressure, and with her developer partner likely growing impatient, Diane escalated her campaign to its most vile and personal stage. She decided to weaponize the full power of the state against us, not just in a trivial way, but by attacking the very foundation of my presence in my grandfather's home. She filed a false report with Adult Protective Services. The knock on the door came on a Wednesday morning. 2 women stood on our porch, one older and clearly the senior partner, the other a younger, earnest-looking caseworker. They were from the County Department of Social Services, and they were there to investigate a complaint of elder abuse. The complaint, the senior caseworker explained with a professionally neutral but clearly uncomfortable expression, was an anonymous tip alleging that a vulnerable senior, Arthur Miller, was being neglected, isolated from his friends, and financially exploited by his recently arrived granddaughter. I felt the blood drain from my face. This was a new level of depravity. She was using a system designed to protect the most vulnerable members of society as a weapon to tear our family apart. She was trying to have me legally removed from my own home, to have me branded as an abuser of the man I had come here to care for. I took a deep breath, my ER training kicking in. Stay calm. Control the situation. Do not get emotional. Present the facts. "Please, come in," I said, my voice steady. "My grandfather is in the living room. We have absolutely nothing to hide." For the next 2 hours, our lives were turned inside out. They interviewed me and Arthur separately. They asked him pointed questions about his finances, his daily routines, his relationship with me. They asked me about my power of attorney, about his will, about why I had left my job to move here. Arthur, to his immense credit, was magnificent. He was calm, lucid, and filled with a quiet, unshakable dignity. He spoke of his life, his late wife, and the joy he felt at having me home. He explained, with wry humor, that I was a terrible cook, but an excellent companion. He made it clear, in no uncertain terms, that I was here at his request and that he was in full command of his faculties. While they spoke with him, I gathered our documents, my grandfather's spotless bill of health from his last doctor's visit, his financial statements showing a healthy and untouched retirement portfolio, a copy of his will, which had been unchanged for 20 years, and the notarized power of attorney documents. I also made a crucial decision. I brought out the file. When the senior caseworker sat down with me again, I presented her with my own dossier. I believe I know who filed this malicious and false report. I said calmly, my grandfather and I are the victims of a sustained campaign of harassment by our HOA president, Diane Vance. This is her latest tactic. I showed her everything, the 16 violation notices, the photographs of the poisoned roses and the vandalized property, the screenshots of the slanderous posts on the community forum, where Diane had explicitly planted the seeds of the very accusations she had now made to them. I even showed her the video of the white Lexus parked down the street the night our pot was smashed. The caseworker's eyes widened as she scrolled through the evidence on my laptop. Her professional neutrality began to crack, replaced by a look of dawning horror and anger. She saw the situation for what it was: not a potential case of elder abuse, but a clear-cut case of vindictive harassment. "Miss Miller," she said, her voice now filled with a quiet sympathy. "Thank you for being so forthcoming. It is abundantly clear that your grandfather is not only well cared for, but deeply loved. It is also clear that this complaint is a retaliatory and fraudulent abuse of our system." She stood up, her demeanor all business. "We will be closing this case as unfounded. Furthermore, I will be filing a formal report with my superiors about the weaponization of our agency for the purpose of neighborhood harassment. Filing a false APS report is a serious offense. This may have legal consequences for the person who made the call." After they left, a profound, heavy silence filled the house. Arthur sat in his armchair, staring out at the garden, his hands clasped tightly on his lap. He looked smaller, frailer than I had ever seen him. Diane's attack had struck at his deepest fear, the loss of his autonomy, of his dignity. That evening, the quiet, methodical part of my brain gave way to a cold, hard resolve. Diane had crossed the final line. She had tried to use the law to sever the bond between me and my grandfather. Now, I would use the law to sever her from the community she had terrorized. I stayed up all night, my fingers flying across the keyboard, not writing notes for a patient's chart, but drafting a comprehensive, detailed criminal complaint, citing the statutes for harassment, stalking, and filing a false police report as an APS complaint often involved law enforcement. I attached every piece of evidence I had gathered. The next morning, I did not just mail it. I drove to the county sheriff's department and hand-delivered my file to the detective in charge of elder abuse cases. The time for defense was over. The time for justice had begun. The final, desperate move from Diane was an act of pure, thuggish intimidation. The failure of her APS gambit, which had now put her on the radar of law enforcement, had clearly pushed her into a corner. The developer was likely pressuring her, and her window to force us out was closing. She abandoned all pretense of using the system and resorted to brute force. The confrontation came on a Thursday evening, just as twilight was beginning to bleed the color from the sky. Arthur and I were in the kitchen, cleaning up after dinner. A loud, aggressive pounding on the front door startled us both. It wasn't the polite knock of a neighbor. It was the heavy, insistent thud of someone demanding entry. Arthur looked at me, a silent question in his eyes. I nodded, and he walked slowly to the entryway, to the small table where he kept the mail and, for the past several months, his old Colt .45. I stayed back in the kitchen, my phone in my hand, my finger hovering over the direct line to the detective I had been working with. Arthur opened the door. Two large men stood on our porch, silhouetted against the fading light. They were dressed in cheap, ill-fitting security guard uniforms, but they had added official-looking patches on the sleeves that read HOA Enforcement. It was a pathetic, transparent attempt to look official. They were big men, built for intimidation, and their expressions were a mixture of arrogance and contempt. Arthur Miller. The first one grunted, holding up a clipboard with a single piece of paper on it. We're HOA enforcement officers. We have a final remediation order for the unpermitted structure in your backyard. We're here to perform a final inspection before the demolition crew arrives tomorrow. You are not officers, Arthur said, his voice calm and steady, betraying none of the fear I felt welling up in my own chest. And you are not coming onto my property. I don't think you're in a position to tell us what we're going to do. Old man. The second thug sneered. He took a step forward, deliberately crowding my grandfather, using his size to loom over him. This is an official HOA action. We have the right to inspect. He reached out and put a hand on my grandfather's chest, shoving him backward. Now, step aside. That was the line. The moment a war of harassment and intimidation became a physical assault on a veteran in his own home. My grandfather, all 140 pounds of him, stumbled back. But he did not fall. He caught his balance, and when he looked up, his face was transformed. The quiet, gentle gardener was gone. In his place was the military police officer who had kept order in the chaotic aftermath of a war. His eyes were like chips of ice. "Son," Arthur said, his voice a low, dangerous growl, "you have made a grave mistake." With a speed that defied his age, he reached into the drawer of the entryway table. He didn't fumble. His hand knew exactly where to go. He brought out the 1948 Colt .45. He didn't raise it. He just held it, its dark, heavy presence seeming to suck all the air out of the room. The sound of him thumbing back the hammer, a single, sharp click, was deafening in the sudden silence. "I was a military policeman in the United States Army," Arthur said, his voice now cold iron. "I've spent my life dealing with bullies and thugs. I know you're not a cop. And this is not an inspection. This is a home invasion." He raised the pistol, holding it with a steady, two-handed grip that had been drilled into him 60 years ago. "You have exactly 3 seconds to get off my porch before I decide to enforce the law myself." The two thugs froze. Their smug, arrogant expressions melted away, replaced by the stark, wide-eyed terror of men who have just realized they have catastrophically misjudged their target. They were staring down the dark, cavernous barrel of a .45 automatic, held by an old man who was suddenly the most dangerous thing they had ever seen. They had come to intimidate a frail senior citizen. They had found a warrior. The standoff on the porch felt like it stretched for an eternity. The two hired thugs stood frozen, their faces pale and slick with sweat in the porch light, staring down the unwavering barrel of my grandfather's Colt. The illusion of their authority, of their power, had been shattered by a single, sharp click of a hammer. While they were paralyzed, I was in motion. The moment the first man had laid a hand on my grandfather, I had acted. I didn't scream. I didn't panic. The ER nurse in me took over, I assessed the threat, identified the immediate need, and executed the protocol. My first call was to the detective I had been working with. "Detective, it's Anna Miller," I said, my voice low and steady, even as my heart hammered against my ribs. "The assault is in progress. 121 Oak Lane. 2 male assailants, impersonating officers, have physically assaulted my grandfather at our front door. He is holding them at bay. We require immediate assistance." My second action was to activate the audio recording feature on my phone. I laid it on the kitchen counter, turning the speaker on so the dispatcher, on a second line I had dialed, could hear everything. And my third action was to speak. While my grandfather held the physical line on the porch, I opened the legal and psychological front from the kitchen. My voice, clear and amplified by the open doorway, cut through the tense silence. To the 2 men on our porch, I began, my tone the same calm, authoritative one I used to use in a chaotic trauma bay. "My name is Anna Miller. I am a registered nurse. I want to inform you that you are being recorded on a live line with the County Sheriff's Department. Every word you say is being logged." I saw the 2 men flinch, their eyes darting nervously from the gun to the dark interior of the house where my voice was coming from. "I also want to inform you," I continued, "that your employer, Mrs. Diane Vance, is already the subject of a multi-agency investigation for harassment, fraud, and for filing a malicious and false report with Adult Protective Services. A file, which I compiled, has already been delivered to the district attorney's office." This was a calculated bluff, a slight exaggeration of the truth, designed to sever them from their support, to make them feel utterly and completely alone. "The woman who hired you cannot protect you," I said, my voice dropping. "She is the target of a criminal investigation. By being here tonight, by impersonating officers and assaulting my grandfather, you have not become her employees. You have become her co-conspirators. You have moved from being paid thugs to being defendants in a felony case." The color drained completely from their faces. They looked at each other, pure panic in their eyes. The one who had shoved my grandfather started to stammer. This is a misunderstanding. We were just following orders." "You were following illegal orders," I countered, relentlessly pressing the psychological advantage. "And now you have a choice. You can be arrested here, tonight, for assault and burglary, and you can take the fall for Diane Vance. Or you can become the state's star witnesses against her. You can tell the police, who are approximately 90 seconds away, the entire truth about how she hired you, what she paid you, and what she ordered you to do. It is the only chance you have of mitigating the serious trouble you are in." I had taken my grandfather's act of physical deterrence and weaponized it, turning a tense standoff into a full-blown interrogation. I had laid out the facts, the consequences, and the one single path to self-preservation. I had given them a way out that required the complete and total betrayal of the woman who had sent them. Just then, the first, distant wail of a siren cut through the night. The sound was like a thunderclap, breaking the last of their resolve. The first thug, the one who had seemed so confident just minutes before, dropped his clipboard. He slowly, carefully, raised his hands into the air. "Okay," he said, his voice a panicked squeak. "Okay. We'll talk. Just tell the old man to put the gun down." My grandfather did not put the gun down. He kept it trained steadily on the 2 men, his face a mask of cold, hard granite, until the first squad car, its lights painting the entire cul-de-sac in strobing flashes of red and blue, slid to a halt at the end of our driveway. The resolution was a swift and satisfying cascade of falling dominoes. The arrival of the real police turned our tense front porch into a formal crime scene. The two thugs, utterly broken and terrified, surrendered without incident. They were immediately separated and began confessing with a desperate eagerness, each trying to paint himself as the reluctant participant and the other as the main instigator, while both firmly pointing the finger at Diane Vance as the architect of the entire affair. My grandfather finally lowered the Colt, handing it over to the lead detective as evidence, its duty done. He was questioned, and I provided a formal statement, along with the USB drive that contained my entire, meticulously compiled dossier on Diane. The video from our security cameras, which had captured the entire confrontation, was the final, irrefutable piece of evidence. 2 hours later, a team of deputies, armed with a hastily issued warrant based on our evidence and the thugs' confessions, arrived at Diane Vance's home. She was arrested and charged with a laundry list of felonies, including conspiracy, burglary, and witness intimidation. The legal fallout was a slow-motion demolition of her life. The investigation into our complaint uncovered her corrupt relationship with Northgate developers, leading to additional charges of fraud. The developer, facing a massive civil lawsuit and a criminal investigation, immediately cut all ties with her. The HOA board, facing a lawsuit from their own insurance company for the board's gross negligence, was forced to resign. Diane, abandoned by her allies and buried under a mountain of evidence, was convicted on multiple counts and sentenced to a term in state prison. The Aspen Ridge community was rocked by the scandal. The quiet, orderly world they had built was revealed to be a facade, ruled by a corrupt and vindictive woman. In the aftermath, a new HOA board was elected, one composed of decent, reasonable people who were horrified by what had happened. Their first act was to issue a formal, public apology to me and my grandfather. They also passed a new bylaw, the Arthur Miller Clause, which permanently exempted all pre-existing properties from any and all aesthetic covenants. The workshop, the symbol of the entire conflict, was safe. In the months that followed, the atmosphere in the neighborhood changed. The coldness and suspicion were replaced by a quiet, profound respect. My grandfather, the quiet old man with the roses, was now a local hero, a symbol of quiet strength and unwavering principle. Our lives returned to a state of peace, but it was a different kind of peace. It was not the passive, fragile peace of a retreat from the world, but a hard-won, resilient peace that we had fought for and secured. My grandfather returned to his garden, his hands once again tending to the roses his wife had planted. I returned to my own quiet routines, the ghosts of the ER finally beginning to fade. One evening, Arthur took the old Colt .45 out of the police evidence locker where it had been stored. He cleaned it one last time, with the same care and reverence as before. But this time, he did not put it in the entryway table. He locked it back in its old military footlocker, its duty finally and truly done. We had found our sanctuary, and we had learned that sometimes the only way to achieve true peace is to be willing to defend it with every fiber of your being.